Voice వస్తుందా? We could able to select 8 papers for the presentation. We congratulate all the presenters who has presented all the 50 papers, and now we will start with the presentation. General presentation rules are 7 minutes presentation, 3 minutes for questions and answers. We are having chairpersons online, Professor Dr. Sai Rajendra sir, and also Dr. MBV Prasad sir, they are online. And also we are having 4 judges online, they will be assessing you. So if any of you are having questions, especially anybody wants to ask questions, kindly SMS to our systems so that we'll ask the candidate the questions. So we wish the candidates on behalf of TSASI all the best. And now I call upon Dr. Chava Harshant, emergency surgery on SARS-CoV-2 positive patients, a case series. Dr. Harshant, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, please carry on with your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, respected faculty. Are my slides visible, sir?
Yes, please go ahead.
I would like to thank TSA Secon for giving me this opportunity to present a paper. My paper is Predictors of Morbidity and Mortality in SARS coronavirus positive patients presenting with acute surgical emergency. The aim of my study would be to predict the variables that would influence the postoperative outcome in coronavirus positive patients presenting with acute surgical emergency. The objectives are like this: to study the variables accounting for postoperative morbidity and mortality in coronavirus positive patients. The variables which I would like to consider are epidemiological factors like age and gender, duration between onset of complaints and operative intervention, clinical and laboratory parameters related to COVID-19, associated comorbidities, type of anesthesia, and the need for postoperative ventilatory support. Coronavirus disease is a communicable disease caused by SARS coronavirus 2, a new global pandemic. Elective surgeries can be deferred among the suspected population, but contemplating emergency surgical intervention is not only challenging, but could be a cause of great concern. The present study is an attempt to look at the surgical emergencies we have encountered and their outcome following surgical intervention among COVID positive patients. Coming to material and methods, 15 patients who presented with acute surgical emergency diagnosed to be SARS coronavirus positive by RT-PCR, rapid antigen or CORAD score on HRCT, and those who required the emergency surgical intervention are included in our study. The variables considered are, as I've already mentioned, epidemiological factors, duration between onset of complaints and operative intervention, preoperative saturation level, CT severity score, D-dimer level at presentation, type of anesthesia, and the need for postoperative ventilatory support. The last one would be associated comorbidities. Coming to the results, the condition that required emergency surgical intervention, categorizing it into 3 categories, we got 8 cases of acute abdomen, 2 cases of polytrauma, which also required emergency laparotomy, and 5 cases of infections, which included Fournier's gangrene, lower limb amputation. The total number of cases are 15, sir. Coming to the results regarding the epidemiological factors, we had 11 cases whose age was greater than 45 years and 4 cases with age less than or equal to 45 years. Among these 11 cases, 5 cases expired in the postoperative period, the percentage accounting to be 45%. Coming to the gender, we had 8 male patients, and among these 8 male patients, 25% mortality was seen. Coming to female gender, 7 cases are present, and among the 7 cases, 42% mortality was seen in the postoperative period. Coming to duration from onset of complaints to surgery, we had only 2 cases who presented with less than or equal to 48 hours, and there were 13 patients who presented after 48 hours. Among these 13 patients, we've observed 38% mortality. And coming to duration from admission to our hospital to taking up the patient for surgery, we could take up this 8 patients for surgery in less than 24 hours, but there was delay in 7 cases. This delay happened because in our institute, the patients are first admitted under general medicine department, and we had to get a referral call from them, which led to a significant delay in taking up these cases for surgery. Coming to CT severity score, I have categorized it into 3 categories. 1 to 6 is mild disease, 8 to 15 is moderate disease, and 16 to 25 indicates severe disease. We had 6 cases in mild category, and there was no mortality noted. and we had 5 cases among the moderate category, among which we observed 20% mortality, and 4 cases are present in severe disease category. Among these, all the 4 cases expired in the post-operative period. Coming to saturation level on room air at presentation, we had 3 cases who had less than or equal to 85% saturation at room air. All these 3 patients expired in the post-operative period, and we had 12 patients who had saturations greater than 85% at presentation on room air, and among these patients, 16% mortality was seen. Coming to preoperative D-dimer levels, 8 patients had less than or equal to 1000 value in the preoperative period, but greater than 1000 was seen in 7 cases. Among these cases, 72% mortality was observed. Coming to anesthesia, I have categorized into general and regional anesthesia. General anesthesia was given in 6 cases, and we have observed 50% mortality in these cases. And 9 cases required regional anesthesia, mostly being spinal, and it was seen that 23% mortality was seen in these cases. Coming to postoperative ventilatory support or oxygen requirement, 3 patients required postoperative ventilatory support, and all these 3 patients we could not rescue these patients in the postoperative period. All these patients expired in the postoperative period within less than 24 hours. And 2 patients required greater than 10 liters of oxygen, and among these 2 patients, 1 patient expired in the postoperative period. Less than or equal to 10 liters of oxygen was seen in 10 patients, and we have seen 10% mortality in these cases. Coming to the associated comorbidities, we had 5 patients with diabetes, 2 patients with hypertension, and 1 case is a known retroviral disease. Among these patients, 1 patient with diabetes and the known retroviral disease patient expired in the postoperative period. Coming to the diagnosis of the cases that expired in the postoperative period, the first case is peritonitis due to ileal perforation. The second case is polytrauma with grade 4 liver injury. Third case was recurrent incisional hernia with acute intestinal obstruction. And fourth case was recurrent inguinal hernia on right side with acute intestinal obstruction. Fifth case was wet gangrene of the right lower limb. Coming to discussion, Francisco et al. Conducted a study in Italy which described that SARS coronavirus positive patients who require emergency surgical intervention are likely to have increased risk of morbidity and mortality. In our study, patients with age greater than 45 years at presentation had more chances of mortality in the postoperative period, and those who survived had a prolonged hospital stay. Majority of these cases were taken up after 48 hours of establishing a diagnosis of acute surgical emergency. The mean duration from onset of complaints to operative intervention was 7.6 days. Delay to contemplate surgery added to the morbidity and mortality in these cases. Patients with CT severity score between 16 to 25 had increased risk of mortality, and patients with D-dimer value greater than 1000 and saturation level less than 85% at room air in the preoperative period had increased risk of mortality. Patients who required general anesthesia also had an increased risk of mortality, and these patients had increased need for postoperative ventilatory support, which also added to the morbidity of these patients. Mean operative time was 110 minutes, and out of the 15 patients in our study, 4 patients got discharged, 6 patients are still under treatment, and 5 patients expired. Coming to conclusion, high-risk COVID-19 cases who underwent emergency surgical intervention under general anesthesia had increased risk of postoperative morbidity and mortality. In these COVID-19 patients, it is mandatory to contemplate immediate surgical intervention when required without undue delay. Adequate preoperative optimization, appropriate surgical intervention, and adjunct postoperative care is likely to improve the outcome in these cases. Larger sample size can validate our results, and there is a need for further study. Thank you, sir. I'm done with my presentation.
Doctor, is it possible that you can exclude some patients without operating after your study?
Sir, no, sir. If all the patients.
The purpose of the study was to stop the cases.
Sir.
After your study, is it possible that you can exclude any?
Sir, I'm sorry, I could not.
See, after your study, is it possible to rule out the patients who may not want to intervene at all?
Sir, I did not get your question, sir. There's just a disturbance. I'm sorry.
Dr. Chava, sir is asking is why is there any possibility to exclude the patients
from the study?
Completely you can exclude, don't treat them at all.
No, sir. All the patients
are required. Anyway, mortality is.
No, sir. All the patients require surgical intervention, sir. There is no possibility that we could exclude them from surgery.
Harshant, that's not the question. Question is, can you give recommendations as to, for future, from your study, can you give any recommendations that these patients need better not to be operated because they are going to die anyway?
Actually, sir, what happened is there is a delay in intervening in these cases, sir. So I think if the patient presents early, it would be
No,
better.
that's
that
not the, no, that's not the answer.
Sir.
After the evaluation of the study,
Sir.
those patients need not be able to survive. Is it possible to avoid? That's all.
Sir, sir, Sai Rajendra sir, voice is breaking, sir.
Harshant, basically question is, so let us say patients like
Sir.
patients who are over the age of 45
Yes,
with
sir.
CT severity index of more than 15
Yes, sir.
and who are oxygen saturation on admission is less than 85%.
Yes, sir.
Can we safely say that there's no point operating on these people? That's the question.
Yes, sir. There would be increased chances of mortality. So it would be we could since there is increased chances of transmission of infection to the surgeons also. It could be better that if we don't intervene in this case.
So yes, I mean, you may
We are not talking about transmission to the surgeon. Okay, we are talking about death,
Mortality is also.
utility of the procedure.
Yes, sir.
these patients are very highly unlikely to come out of the surgery successfully. So maybe they better not operated and comfort care is better.
Yes.
Some sort of recommendation like that. Thank you. Good study in the need of the hour, I should say.
Thank you, sir.
Well done.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Chava, for a nice presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sir, now I am having a small appeal request for the chairpersons and the judges in the virtually. Actually, we are having one presentation which is missed by Dr. Pankaj ji on paper. So, sir is requesting for, he is waiting in online for some time.
free.
Yes, sir.
Whereas this disorder, there will be some tension.
Were carried out under spinal anesthesia. Post-operatively, single dose of PCM was given in all patients, following with yes, sir.
Is there any relevance with the thickness of the fascia you are using? Some patients may not be having very thick fascia to support your support the surgery. So
Yes, sir.
are you taking all these patients into consideration or leaving on
No,
table?
sir. Though, after opening the external, after opening the up to the external oblique aponeurosis, if the external oblique aponeurosis was thin and weakened out, though they were excluded from the study from both the groups, sir.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr.
Thank you,
Kavya.
sir.
Now we will move on to the next presentation. Next presenter, kindly come online.
Good evening, sir.
Dr. Divya Jyoti. Yeah,
Yes, sir.
yeah, please. Good evening, Amma. Please carry on with your presentation. Your time starts now.
Good evening, faculty, respected faculty. I'm presenting a paper on surgical audit on acute abdomen. Coming to introduction, surgical audit, it is defined as systematic critical analysis of quality of surgical care that is reviewed by peers against the recognized standards, and the analysis then it is further used to inform and improve the surgical practice with the goal of improving quality of care to the patients. Coming to the history, the lady with the lamb, that is the Florence Nightingale, was the first ever to conduct the clinical audits in the war in Turkey during 1853 to 1855. Later, Ernst Hegruves and Amory Codman from Great Britain and USA introduced the clinical audits. Later, they have become mandatory since then from 1950s. And as a majority of the emergency admissions to the surgical wards are of patients complaining of abdominal pain, but surprisingly, there is little information regarding the clinical spectrum of the disease and the management done and the outcome after admission to the hospital. So I came up with auditing all the acute abdominal emergencies. Coming to aims and objectives of my study, to compile the data of emergency admissions for acute abdominal conditions and to determine the clinical spectrum of disease, management done, outcome and mortality rate. Coming to material and methods, the study included all the emergency admissions of the patients complaining of acute abdominal pain in one surgical unit of Department of General Surgery in our hospital during the period of 1st August 2018 to 29 February 2020, that is 18 months. Medico-legal cases were excluded and type of study is cross-section study. All data was compiled from the primary source of information, the record registers and the OT registers. Sample size is 378. Duration of study is 18 months. Basic investigations done in all cases were complete hemogram, blood grouping, renal function test, viral markers, chest X-ray, erect abdomen and ultrasound abdomen. And coming to observation and results, out of 378 acute abdominal emergencies, 64%, that is 243 cases were male and 36%, that is 135 cases were female. And coming to age distribution, the subjects were mostly clustered from between 2nd to 4th decade of life, constituting 49% of all the cases, and later 26% of the cases are clustered between 4th to 6th decade of life. And there was no significant difference in rates of admissions to the different months of year. And coming to clinical diagnosis, the most common diagnoses were first acute appendicitis, constituting 33%, followed by cholecystitis 21%, and then intestinal obstruction 13%, and then hollow viscous perforation 10%, and the least common would be liver abscess, pancreatitis, and miscellaneous causes. Coming to disease-specific age distribution, appendicitis cases were mostly clustered between 1st to 4th decade of life. Most common cases are between 2nd to 4th decade of life, and cholecystitis were clustered between 2nd to 6th decade of life, and most common are between 2nd to 4th decade. And intestinal obstruction are also clustered between 2nd to 6th decade of life, and 44% cases are in between 2nd to 4th decade of life. And peritonitis cases, highest percentage of the cases are present between 2nd to 4th decade of life. Whereas liver abscess, it is equally distributed between 2nd to 6th decade of life, and pancreatitis, the highest number of cases are present between 4th to 6th decade. And non-specific abdominal pain, they are equally distributed between 2nd to 6th decade of life. Coming to age more than 60 years, the most common cause of acute abdomen in age more than 60 years in my study is acute cholecystitis, followed by intestinal obstruction, followed by peritonitis, and then liver abscess and pancreatitis. Coming to gender-wise clinical spectrum, appendicitis, out of 129 cases of appendicitis, 82 cases, that is 64% cases were male, and cholecystitis is equally distributed between male and females. And intestinal obstruction, 70 cases were male, and peritonitis, 79.4% were male. And coming to liver abscess and pancreatitis, it is most commonly seen in males. And liver abscess, 95%, that is out of 1918 cases were seen in males, and in pancreatitis, out of 1916 cases were seen in males. And coming to non-specific abdominal pain, 54% cases were seen in females. And coming to specific causes, coming to intestinal obstruction, out of total 50 cases, the most common cause of intestinal obstruction in my study is obstructed hernias, accounted for 32% cases, followed by adhesions, followed by intra-abdominal abscess, and then TB abdomen. The least common causes would be volvulus. Out of 4 cases, all are of sigmoid volvulus, and then mesenteric ischemia and carcinoma colon. And on coming to peritonitis cases, out of 39 peritonitis cases, the most common cause is that is 41% cases were of prepyloric perforation, followed by D1 perforation, and then gastric and ileal. And 3 cases had cecal perforation due to distal colonic mass. And followed by non-specific abdominal pain. Out of 28 cases of non-specific abdominal pain, non-specific abdominal pain, it is defined as acute abdominal pain less than 7 days of duration, for which no diagnosis have been established even after examination and baseline investigations. And we needed to do extensive investigations like upper GI endoscopy and CT scan, and some cases we needed to do ascitic fluid analysis also, and diagnostic laparoscopy also we need in some cases. And in 35% of the cases found out to be gynecological causes, and 28 cases found out to be TB abdomen, and 17% of the cases, they are readmitted cases after surgery done for the previous obstruction or appendicitis. And 5 cases we couldn't find out any diagnosis, and 1 case we found out to be Crohn's disease. And coming to management, out of 378 admissions, 231 cases, that is 61% were treated surgically, and 147, that is 39% treated conservatively. And out of 231 surgeries, using National Confidential Inquiry into Patient Outcome and Death Classification for Surgical Intervention, 71 were emergency operations, 72 were urgent operations, 52 were expedient, and 36 were elective scheduled operations. And out of total surgeries we did, most common surgeries were of appendectomies, that is 51%, followed by aloviscus perforation 17%, then acute intestinal obstruction, then cholecystectomy, and the least common were for liver abscess, pancreatitis, non-specific abdominal pain, and miscellaneous conditions. And coming to appendectomy, out of 129 cases, we surgically treated for 120 cases, open we did 113 cases, and lab we did for 9 cases. Lab to open conversion required for 1 case, and unnecessary appendectomies were 8, which is known by histopathology post-op. And complicated appendicitis we have seen in 14 cases. And out of 82 cholecystitis cases, 55 were treated conservatively and followed up later for interval cholecystectomy. And 26 were underwent surgery for lap cholecystectomy, and 2 cases required open conversion, and 1 needed urgent open cholecystectomy in lieu of gangrenous cholecystitis. And this is a bar diagram showing the operative and expectant management. Appendicitis, 93% cases required operative management in my study. Cholecystitis, 33% cases required urgent and expedient surgeries, and acute intestinal obstruction, 74% cases required surgery. And in peritonitis, almost 100% cases required emergent or urgent surgeries. And coming to liver abscess, pancreatitis, and non-specific abdominal pain, the percentage for surgery is less, and they are treated mostly on expectant management. Coming to mortality, total 15 patients died out of 378 cases, and 4 cases died during conservative management. And mortality rate of my study is 3.9%, and perioperative mortality rates is high in acute intestinal obstruction, that is out of 50 cases, 7 cases have died, and followed by holoviscous perforation 20%. 2 cases were one that we operated in emergency for gangrenous cholecystitis, and other which required the open conversion. Patient died due to post-operative hemorrhage, and then followed by pancreatitis, liver abscess, and non-specific abdominal. There are 4. 2 were the cases of subacute intestinal obstruction. And 2 were necrotizing pancreatitis and non-specific abdominal pain. And duration of hospital stay, the 378 admissions resulted in total bed occupancy inpatient days, and duration of stay increased significantly after the age of 40 years. 61 to 80 years accounted for more 29% of bed occupancy, that is 969 inpatient days. And patients with non-specific abdominal pain more than 40 years were more frequently subjected to definitive investigations and needed more duration of hospital stay. That acute intestinal obstruction case and non-specific abdominal pain cases are having more duration of hospital stay from 5 to 40 days, and least duration of hospital stay required for
Yeah. Sir, okay, sir. Dr. Divya, can you please conclude?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, please.
Of modern surgical practice, from consultant to trainee, involvement in audit is desirable and increasingly becoming compulsory. This cross-sectional study is an attempt to determine the variety of acute helped us to understand the variety of clinical spectrums of abdominal pain, acute abdomen, management modalities done, outcomes in our setup. The results of this study indicate that there is need to review methods of management and the factors that determine the duration of stay in the patients, especially suffering from non-specific abdominal pain and elderly age. And the information obtained in this study is not an end, because the audit has to be analyzed with specific institutional standards and necessary changes need to be done, and progress should be monitored and re-auditing should be done. And this is cyclical process. It is must to make the improvements and to sustain the improvements. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Amma. Now the paper
Yeah.
is open for discussion.
Yeah, Dr. Divya,
Sir.
yeah, in your study, the appendectomy is what you have quoted. Majority were done by open appendectomy, which is not the gold standard now. Out
Yes.
of the 8 cases, you have done laparoscopic appendectomy, you have to convert one into an open appendectomy.
Yes,
So
sir.
only 7 out of 112, 113 cases. Definitely, that's a big volume open appendectomies, which is not the gold standard as per today. So I think your audit definitely needs to improve your own methods, how laparoscopy can be still done in all these acute appendicitis cases. Otherwise, rest of the things were quite nicely done. Thank you. Nice.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, are there any other questions, sir?
Yes, there's a short one. Divya, basically the idea of audit is you need to come up with a set of recommendations, just like one of them, like Dr. C.R.K. Prasad sir has mentioned. Out of your observations, you have to compare it with benchmark standards and then come out with a set of recommendations which you need to implement and then re-audit after 6 months or 12 months. So that's what completes the audit cycle. But otherwise, a well done study. Good.
Thank you, sir.
If there are no more questions, we will move on to the next paper. Thank you, Dr. Divya. Nice presentation.
Thank you, sir.
I request Dr. Gautam to please be ready. And all the presenters kindly make a note that your presentation should be completed in 7 minutes. You plan in such a way that your presentation should finish in 7 minutes so that you will have an appropriate time for question and answer assessment. Thank you.
At 7th minute, you will get a buzzer.
Good afternoon, one and all. I'm Dr. Gautam. Meanwhile, I connect. I would like to take a moment on behalf of all my friends to thank Team TSSECon for providing this amazing platform, and we are all grateful for bringing the most out of us in these times of COVID. Thank you all. And today's title is a prospective comparative study between laparoscopic mesh repair and open Lichtenstein mesh repair of inguinal hernia. To introduce, hernia is defined as abnormal protrusion of an organ or a tissue through a defect in its surrounding walls. Although there are many different types of hernias, they are usually related to the abdomen, with approximately 75% of all hernias occurring in the inguinal region. Lichtenstein tension-free open mesh repair has remained the gold standard criterion in terms of long-term outcome for many years. Laparoscopic inguinal hernia is gaining popularity in the recent few years. Laparoscopic repair offers advantages in form of smaller incisions, faster recovery, and reduced recurrence. Because of the new approaches to the groin from inside the abdomen, unique challenges and complications have been encountered. The standard method of inguinal hernia repair has little changes over hundreds of years since Bessini introduced in 1887. And annual statistics from various countries show that despite many modifications introduced by Scholes, McVey, and others, 10 to 15% of inguinal hernias are for recurrent hernias. Post-op pain is an important outcome to consider when choosing between laparoscopic and open repair of inguinal hernia. Laparoscopic hernia repair is more costly, difficult to learn with a steep learning curve, and carries a risk of serious visceral and vascular injuries. Recurrence rates for endoscopic techniques are generally underestimated because most studies are either not prospective or do not include long-term follow-up evaluation. My aim is to compare the effectiveness and safety of laparoscopic, that is total extraperitoneal repair, and conventional open mesh repair, Lichtenstein in terms of inguinal hernia. My objectives are to compare the following in laparoscopic and hernia repair, that is operating time, intraoperative and postoperative complications, post-op pain and recovery, recurrence rates. The patient and methods. My study was carried out with 50 patients, 25 in each group in inguinal hernia between Jan 2019 to March 2020 in a tertiary care hospital, and it's a clinical prospective study. And inclusion criteria has male patients presented with uncomplicated unilateral inguinal hernia aged between 18 to 60 years, whereas the exclusion criteria has patients excluded between 80 and above 60. Female patients are excluded, patients undergoing other combined procedures, patients with complicated signs of obstruction, strangulation, hernias, and bilateral inguinal hernias have been excluded. Patients with comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes mellitus, thyroid is hyper and bronchial asthma, etc. are being excluded. Patients in whom laparoscopic hernia repair is contraindicated. Following statistical methods were applied in the study: chi-square test and student t-test and mean and standard deviations were used. And the observation and the results, the table 1 shows patients which are divided into the 2 surgeries, laparoscopic and open mesh repair, which are 25 in each, and distribution of patients according to duration of surgery. In laparoscopic, less than 60 minutes, there are 2 patients, and in open, there are 16 patients, constituting 64%, and 60 to 90, constituting 20 patients, which has a major thing, constituting 80%, and 7 in open. More than 90 minutes has 3 in laparoscopic and 2 patients in open group. The distribution of cases according to intra-op complications, the laparoscopic, I did not find any intra-op complications, whereas open surgery, we had a vascular injury. Distribution of patients according to post-op complications, the pain which was calculated with Wong-Baker scale and nerve scale with 2 lap patients and open patients are 4. Urinary retention is in 4 patients in open and 2 in laparoscopy. Hematoma or seroma formation was seen more in open patients than in laparoscopy, which had only 1 patient. Mesh infection was was not seen in either of them. Neuralgia was seen in open group that constituted around 2 patients. Testicular swellings around 1 in laparoscopic and 4 patients in open group, constituting 72% of complications in open and 24% complications in the laparoscopic group. The discussion part, the study compares outcomes in patients with unilateral inguinal hernias treated in laparoscopic repair with general anesthesia to Lichtenstein tension-free herniaplasty with spinal anesthesia. Following were compared in both groups: intraoperative complications like bladder injury, bowel injury, vascular injury, length of hospital stay and recurrence of hernia at intervals of 3 months and 6 months. Incidence of inguinal hernia was highest in age group of around varying from 51 to 60 years. 1 patient in open group had a vascular injury. Intra-op complications are less in laparoscopic group compared to open group. It is not significant with this sample size though. Mean duration of surgery is more in laparoscopic repair, that is around 87 minutes in my study compared to open mesh repair, which had only 64 minutes, and the p-value was less than 0.001, so which was significant. Post-op pain is less in laparoscopic group compared to the open group, which is 16%. Urinary retention is seen in 16% of the patients of open group and 8 in laparoscopic group. Incidence of seroma is 16% in open and 4 in lap group as well, and no incidence of wound or mesh infection, as already told, and testicular swellings is 16, and neuralgia in 8 and 0 in TEP group. Mean length of hospital stay is less in laparoscopic repair, that is 3.92 days compared to open repair, that is around 7.80, and the p-value was less than 0.001, which was significant. Post-op complications were more in open group compared to laparoscopic. According to statistical analysis of p-value is not significant, which signifies there is no much difference in post-op complications in both groups with the sample size. There was no recurrence in both TEP and open group noted during the follow-up period of 3 months and 6 months as well. This table shows the study compared with Brinkman, who did in Czechoslovakia. He had the duration of surgery of lap of 50 minutes, and my present study included 87 minutes, and open group of 45 minutes by Brinkman and 64 minutes in my present study. And intra-op complications by Neumayer from France as 4.8% of intra-op complications in lap and 0% of lap in my study, and open group of 1.9% by Neumayer and 4% in my study. Length of hospital stay by Brinkman was 5 days in laparoscopic and 3.92 days in the present study, whereas open it was 7 days for Brinkman and 7.8 days for the present study. And the recurrence rates were 2.2% in the laparoscopic by Brinkman, and either of them had recurrence in my study with 3 months and 6 months of follow-up. So to conclude, the present study is a prospective comparative study between the Lichtenstein tension-free mesh repair and the TEP laparoscopic inguinal hernia mesh repair. The study was conducted with an intention to prospectively compare the intraoperative and postoperative complications, operating time, length of hospital stay, and recurrence between Lichtenstein and TEP laparoscopic hernia. The TEP group has got less intraoperative and postoperative complications compared to the open group clinically, but statistically it is not significant. Length of hospital stay is less in TEP group compared to the open group, and operating time is more in the TEP group than in the open group. These are my references.
Now the paper is open for discussion, sir.
Doctor, good study, but now a good number of RCTs are available and a meta-analysis of RCTs are available on the subject. Okay, what do you think the role or effectiveness of your study in the present scenario?
Sir,
RCT.
sir, sorry, sir.
Yours is not a randomized trial. There are good number of randomized trials are available, and also meta-analysis of randomized trials are available now on this subject. So what do you think is the value of your study in the present study?
With this, we encounter a lot of inguinal hernia repairs, but Leichenstein mesh repair is already the gold standard, and the laparoscopic method, which is evolving to be the gold standard with lot of expertise in laparoscopy hernia repairs by all the surgeons. I really wanted to compare the significance of intra post-op complications in either groups, and also the stay and the recurrence rates in both of them.
That's okay. The question is not regarding that. Whether your study is showing anything new or anything extra to learn than compared to the other studies. That's
But my follow-up study, I think it has to be more, sir. With this, I think I can significantly do that.
You said that there are exclusion. Whenever there is a contraindication for laparoscopy, you have excluded those people from your study.
Yes,
so, how many people you have included? Among them, how many you have excluded on this criteria?
Sir, we have excluded patients with who have already undergone prostatectomy or other.
So you would have told that these many are included. Ultimate exclusions are these are according to the criteria that you have not mentioned. That's why I asked this question. Okay, thank you.
So, Gautam, in your presentation, in some places you mentioned TEP, in some places you mentioned laparoscopic repair, in some places you mentioned laparoscopic TEP repair like that. So just make sure that you maintain uniformity all across. Okay? So just when you're writing, that is one thing. Second thing is, for Dr. Narayan Rao sir's question, what you should have come up is that we want to see in our own setup. What sir is suggesting is that the laparoscopic repair, there are multiple studies already in across the world. So what is the purpose of you doing in your hospital? Basically, you want to study in your own hospital whether laparoscopic repair is comparable with the rest of the world. And other thing is the surgeon. Is it the same surgeon performing both open and laparoscopic repair, or are they different?
They're different
surgeons. Again, that will lead to some bias and experience of the surgeon that needs to be taken into account. And what vascular structure have you injured in open group?
I think it's epigastric.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Okay. Fine.
Hello?
Thank you.
Hello? 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 Yeah. In your presentation, you mentioned that there are significant number of complications in open technique. What is the reason for that much of significant complications in your study? Comparatively, you have showed it's a very high complication rate when compared with routine open technique surgeries. Is the juniors are operating, or what is the reason for that very high complication rate in open technique also?
Sir, only one case was complicated, so that was actually only 4% of all of that. So that was only one complication which we had. Other laparoscopic, we had no complications. Sir.
No, I'm asking about open. Open, you are told is very, very high rate of complications. You are told.
Sir, we have encountered only one complication.
That is only significant
vascular
complication you are telling about that.
So, sorry, sir, it was not audible.
Dr. Sai Rajendra sir, are you having any question, sir? Final question?
The thing is muted actually. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Now you are audible, sir.
Yeah. My question was the retention of urine. Was it related to the procedures or to the age of laparoscopic? They had more retention or
Sir, I'm sorry, sir. You are not audible, sir.
I think we can go to the next.
Yes, sir. If there are no more questions, we will conclude this paper. And thank you, Dr. Gautam. Nice presentation. We'll move on to the next one now.
Next presenter, Shushruta. Next presenter is Sushruta. After all these presentations, maybe we are planning case presentations. Sushruta, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Sushruta, okay. Sushruta, you are having 7 minutes time, okay? You have to present in such a way.
Yes, ma'am. Is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yeah, you are visible and your screen is also visible.
Yes. Shall I start, ma'am?
1 second. Ready?
Yes, you can start.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. I thank the panel and TSAS ICON for choosing me to present today. My paper is on microvascular reconstruction in a resource-constrained center, its feasibility and outcome. The advent of microsurgery has revolutionized the management of head and neck cancers because the reconstruction of head and neck cancers involves reconstruction of different kinds of tissues like skin, mucosa, bony defects and all, and also different functions, and hence it is complex. And however, microsurgery is not so easily available, and the number of surgeries that are being done does not meet the increasing need for them. So in our study, we have achieved a success rate of 86.95% by performing free tissue transfer, which is supposed to be the gold standard for head and neck reconstruction in the present era, using only basic microsurgical instruments that are available in our center with a meager resources. The aims and objectives are the aim of our study is to show that the procedures that need sophisticated equipment can even be done with limited resources if a good surgical technique and post-operative care is applied. As I've explained, reconstruction of head and neck is complex, and the defects also, because defects in one part affect the function in another part. And the options for reconstruction include primary closure, autologous skin grafting, and different kinds of flaps. And the challenges which are encountered could be partial flap necrosis and need for multiple surgeries in case of bulky flaps, and inability to cover bony defects, which have all been addressed by the advent of microvascular surgery. And free tissue transfer has the best outcome in head and neck reconstruction, but as I've told, it is being done only in a few centers. So the aim of my study is to make it available for a larger group, as it is a feasible procedure. The materials and methods, it's a retrospective study done using the medical records of 23 patients who have undergone free tissue transfer for head and neck reconstruction between November 2018 and January 2020 within a span of 14 months. And similar surgical technique was used for all the patients using basic microvascular instruments and loop magnification for magnification of operative field, and a single surgeon operated on all the patients. Coming to the reconstruction part, and the subsites which are involved and that needed resection were 18 cases of buccal mucosal cancer, 1 case of lower lip cancer, and 3 cases of lower alveolar cancer, and 1 case of upper alveolar cancer. And the surgical technique was loop magnification for retrieval of donor tissue, and also anastomosis of donor and recipient vessels using 8 nylon interrupted sutures, and 1 arterial and 2 venous anastomosis was done, and heparinized saline irrigation was used during the procedure, and the patency of anastomosis was checked intraoperatively and postoperatively meticulously throughout the stay in the hospital. So coming to the demographic data, out of the 23 flaps, 16 were male patients and 7 were female patients with a mean age of 40.9 years, and there were no significant comorbidities except for 3 patients who had diabetes mellitus and 5 patients who had hypertension, which did not show any significant effect on the outcome of the flap. And all the 23 patients had tobacco use in some form, either smoking or chewable, and the mean duration of surgery including resection and reconstruction was about 9.5 hours, and the mean duration of hospital stay was about 11 days. And the first image shows the defect created by resection of carcinoma of the lower alveolus, and the left bottom shows the marking that is done on the donor side for a free fibular flap. Preoperative Doppler was used to locate the pedicle, and on the right bottom corner we can see the flap after harvesting before it was detached from the donor side. And in the left top corner, we can see the vascular anastomosis. On the top right corner, we see the mandibular reconstruction, which was done with the fibula, and it was fixed using screws. And on the left bottom corner, we can see the soft tissue and mucosal coverage, where the skin paddle from the free fibula flap was used for both mucosal coverage and the external skin defect, and the final appearance is seen on the right bottom corner. The complications which we encountered were ranging from bleeding, infection, necrosis, orocutaneous fistula, and complete flap loss. 3 flaps were completely lost, one intraoperatively due to difficulty in anastomosis, and 2 other flaps in the postoperative period. There were no significant donor side complications except for one, which was managed conservatively, and the rest of the complications were conservatively managed, except for orocutaneous fistula. One of them had to be closed, and for bleeding, we had to be explored in one case. And all the flaps could be salvaged, even despite all these complications, because of an early intervention. But 3 flaps which are lost needed alternative flap reconstruction. And out of the total 23 flaps, 19 were free fibula, and 3 were radial forearm flap, and 1 was anterolateral thigh flap. So the results, as I've discussed, age, gender, and comorbidities did not affect the flap outcome in my study. All the complications were addressed by early intervention, and all except 3 could be salvaged. Alternative flap reconstruction was done in cases with complete flap loss. Meticulous technique and good postoperative care were critical for the optimal outcome. As I've discussed, free flap reconstruction is a gold standard, and the number of centers does not meet the requirement for them. So in our center, we could successfully perform despite the lack of sophisticated equipment with certain basic instruments, intraoperative and postoperative measures. All the patients were operated for some form of head and neck cancer, mostly middle-aged with a rural background, mostly illiterates with a history of tobacco use, and with no significant effect of comorbidities over the outcome of the flap. And we have executed the same technique, and a single surgeon did all the reconstructive procedure, and the flap was meticulously monitored throughout the post-operative stay in the hospital. And in a similar study which was done by Vanjala et al., there was a less frequent flap monitoring, which was quoted as a possible factor for flap complications, and the success rate was lesser than ours. And by encouraging enteral feeds as early as possible, the nutritional
Dr. Sushruta, please check your net connection. Dr. Sushruta, are you able to hear us?
Please switch off your video. That will improve the streaming.
Dr. Sushruta, please follow sir's suggestion.
We lost her.
Sir, with your permission, we'll move on to the next one, sir. We'll give again another 2 minutes to conclude, sir, for her once the and after next paper at the end of the. Yes, sir. If it is okay, we'll move on, sir, because it is a technical problems. Now we will move on to Dr. Uday Tej. Dr. Uday, are you ready?
Sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, we are able to hear you. Please share your screen.
Yes, sir. So not able to share my screen. So 1 second.
Okay, be comfortable.
Yes, sir. Can you see the screen, sir?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, please start
Sir.
your presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. My paper is a study to determine the value of preoperative hyperbilirubinemia as a predictor of complicated appendicitis. Introduction. Acute appendicitis is the commonest cause of acute surgical abdomen. Appendicectomy is most frequently performed urgent abdominal surgery and is often the first procedure performed by a surgeon in training. Diagnosis of appendicitis is based on history, clinical examination, laboratory values, and imaging. In some cases, the signs and symptoms are variable and the diagnosis can be difficult to make. Delay in the diagnosis of acute appendicitis leads to the perforation, peritonitis, and increased mortality. Incidence of perforation ranges from 50 to 90 in various series. To supplement clinical diagnosis and to reduce the frequency of unnecessary appendicectomy, the importance of laboratory investigations like WBC count, C-reactive protein values have been stressed. The use of ultrasonography as a diagnostic tool for appendicitis has been widely known and studied. Scores combining clinical features and laboratory investigations have also been developed. Available scores are Alvarado score and modified Alvarado score. Now there is no confirmatory marker for laboratory confirmatory marker for preoperative diagnosis of complicated appendicitis. Importance of raised bilirubin has not been stressed in acute appendicitis or a particular perforation. Bacterial invasion in appendix leads to transmigration of bacteria and release of pro-inflammatory cytokines such as TNF-alpha, IL-6 and other cytokines, which in turn reach the liver via portal system and may produce inflammation, abscess or dysfunction of liver directly or indirectly by altering the hepatic blood flow. Present study was conducted to assess the relationship between hyperbilirubinemia and acute appendicitis and to find out whether elevated bilirubin levels has a predictive potential for diagnosis of gangrenous suppression and perforation of acute appendicitis. Methods used were: the study was conducted in Department of General Surgery, Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Hospital, Warangal. This was a prospective observational study with 100 consecutive cases. All patients who were diagnosed to have appendicitis are admitted in the surgical department and who underwent appendicectomy were included in the study. Appendicectomy performed incidentally, patients with appendicular mass or lump, history of alcohol liver disease, hemolytic anemias, liver diseases associated with hyperbilirubinemia, history of viral hepatitis, Gilbert-Dubin-Johnson syndromes were excluded. Data was collected by the interview with the participant and with the help of structured proforma, clinical examination, routine blood examinations, Alvarado score, ultrasound, histopathology examination, pre and post-operative total bilirubins and direct and indirect bilirubins. The upper limit of normal bilirubin, total bilirubin is 1.4 mg per deciliter. The data was uploaded in Microsoft Excel sheet and analyzed with an ROC curve and kappa test. The study had a sample size of 100 patients and the study was conducted for 12 months from March 2019 to February 2020. Results. In our study, 57 patients were males and 43 were females. Out of 100 cases, 44 were complicated. The complications included perforated appendix, gangrenous appendix, and appendicitis with suppression. Out of 100 cases, 62 cases had elevated bilirubin preoperatively, in which 35 cases were having complications like gangrenous suppression and perforation. Out of 62 cases that had elevated bilirubin, preoperatively, 31 cases, that is 50%, the bilirubin level came down to normal limits after 72 hours of appendicectomy. Out of 44 cases, 35 cases of complicated appendix have elevated total bilirubin values preoperatively. Of these 35 cases, 21 cases bilirubin level came down to normal levels after 72 hours. Out of 100 patients, 8% have elevated alkaline phosphatase, that 8% have less than 46 alkaline phosphatase, and 46 to 16 has 90% of patients, and elevated alkaline phosphatase more than 116 in 2 patients. Out of 100 patients, 46 patients had leukocyte count more than 11,000. In our study, CRP values was positive for 81 patients. In 100 patients, Alvarado score was mean of 6.5, maximum of 10, and minimum of 4. On histopathology, 56 patients were acute appendicitis without complication, 36 were perforated appendicitis, 11 were gangrenous appendicitis, and 20 were suppurative appendicitis. From this study, the sensitivity and specificity of suppurative appendix was found out to be preoperative total bilirubin cutoff was 1.4 and had maximum best specificity and sensitivity. In ROC curve, the area under the curve was 0.741 and confidence interval of 95% and p-value less than 0.01. So taking the cutoff value for suppurative appendicitis and bilirubin value was 1.45 mg per dl. The sensitivity was 55%, specificity was 91.1%, and accuracy was 81%. For the study of sensitivity and specificity of preoperative total bilirubin values in predicting the suppurative appendicitis is found out to be 1.45 at mg per 1.45 mg per dl at best sensitivity and for perforated appendix, the cutoff value was 1.55. So the area under the ROC curve was 0.852 and the confidence interval was 90% and p-value is less than 0.001. The Kappa test was done, preoperative bilirubin was of 1.45 and to agreement with histopathology of total bilirubin, the Kappa test was 0.66 and p-value was less than 0.01, which was a substantial agreement. So taking cutoff total bilirubin of 1.55 for predicting perforated appendix, the sensitivity was 69.2%, specificity was 94.6% and accuracy was 89.9%. The same thing for gangrenous appendix, the cutoff value was 1.8 mg per dl and the Kappa value was 0.69 and p-value was less than 0.001, which shows substantial agreement. So taking cutoff value of total bilirubin as 1.8 mg per dl for predicting gangrenous appendicitis, the sensitivity was 63.6%, specificity was 98.2% and accuracy was 92.5%. Discussion.
Dr. Uday.
Hyperbilirubemia in
Dr. Uday, can you please conclude?
Sir.
Conclude.
Sure, sir.
In 1 minute.
From our study.
1 minute.
Yes, sir. From our study of 100 consecutive patients of appendicitis, 62 were having hyperbilirubemia, and 44 patients in our study had complicated appendix, out of which 35 patients have hyperbilirubemia. And according to the study, specificity to finding the complicated appendix, such as perforated appendix, suppurative appendix, and gangrenous appendix were pretty high. So inclusion of total bilirubin estimation in routine preoperative laboratory investigations of acute appendicitis can help in predicting the complications. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, doctor. Now the paper is open for discussion, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Teja.
Sir. Yes.
First thing is a small observation. You, in your study, you said unnecessary appendicitis. So don't use that word unnecessary, unwanted, or anything like that. Instead of that, you can say negative appendicectomies. Negative means probably you did not find any histopathological evidence. So this is a term you should not use. One. Second thing, as your study rightly said, there has been sepsis related increase in bilirubin and alkaline phosphatase. So to understand the severity of the sepsis, probably one of the preoperative requirement, probably what you recommended, I think it holds good.
Yes,
I think that.
And also every patient can't afford for CT scan, sir. So bilirubin will be a good estimator for complicated appendix.
Simple estimation would tell us the severity of the sepsis.
Yes.
I think that's rightly accepted. Thank you. Good.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Udete, you have told that you have excluded Gilbert's disease also. The sick patient, complication of appendicitis is admitted. How do you diagnose Gilbert's disease and exclude them?
Sir, actually, any congenital disorder, all congenital disorder like Gilbert-Dubin-Johnson syndrome were excluded from the study, sir.
You should know that the patient has got Gilbert's. No? How do you diagnose that to exclude that? That's the question.
Sir, you have to do chromosomal study. No.
you can do is only if the patient is a known case of Gilbert's, then only it is possible. Otherwise, Gilbert's we can have little more bilirubin than the bilirubin what you are showing in a severe acute hepatitis.
I don't know that one.
Question. With serum bilirubin greater than 1.45 and greater than 1.8, was jaundice clinically evident? This is question from the judges.
No, sir. Jaundice was not clinically evident in all the patients. Only few patients with gangrenous appendix who had above 2 were clinically significant, sir.
Okay, sir. MBV, sir. Any last question, sir?
No, I think we covered everything. The only thing is it won't distinguish between any other sepsis in abdomen from appendicitis. Basically, it's a marker of severe sepsis in the abdomen. With the clinical features of right abdominal pain and tenderness, you may conclude that it is appendicitis, but
yes, sir. Yes.
Sir,
there are limitations to your study. Good presentation.
Sir, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uday. Next, we will move on to the next one.
Next presenter is Venkat Prashant. Venkat Prashant is there?
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah. Share your screen. You should conclude by 7 minutes. Prashant?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Can I start, ma'am? Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Venkat Prashant. I'm presenting on validity of P-POSSUM score in Indian patients undergoing emergency gastrointestinal surgeries. Measuring the outcome of emergency surgical procedures is crucial for both the patient and healthcare providers, by which improvement in healthcare services can be achieved. The basic aim of any surgical procedure is reduction in morbidity and mortality rates. But comparison using crude mortality and morbidity rates in fallacious because of differences in general health of the local population and variable presentation of the patient's condition. This scoring seeks to quantify a patient's risk of adverse outcome based on the severity of illness derived from the data available at an early stage of hospital stay. P-POSSUM scoring is often used as a tool to assess and audit the performance of individual and institution. It is popularly known as surgeon-based scoring system. As only a few studies have been performed in developing countries, this study was taken up at district-level hospital, catering mainly to rural population. The aim of this study is to validate a P-POSSUM scoring system among Indian patients in predicting anticipated morbidity and mortality rate. To compare with data with actual morbidity and mortality rate in general surgical patients admitted for emergency GI surgical procedures. It's a prospective study done over a period of 12 months with a sample size of 80 patients. Data collection was done after obtaining an informed and written consent from the patients. Patients of either sex undergoing emergency GI surgeries, patients of more than 18 years and who are willing to participate in the study were included. Patients less than 18 years of age undergoing elective surgeries, who are immunocompromised or with diabetes, patients lost to follow-up but not willing to participate in the study were excluded. P-POSSUM scoring system has physiological parameters and operative parameters. Physiological parameters consist of 12, which are age, cardiac history, respiratory history, blood pressure, pulse rate, Glasgow Coma Scale, hemoglobin level, total leukocyte count, urea concentration, sodium level, potassium level, and electrocardiography. And operative parameters consist of 6, which are operative severity, multiple procedures, total bed loss, peritoneal soiling, presence of malignancy, and mode of surgery. The expected mortality and morbidity rates were obtained using linear regression analysis, and the observed to expected ratio was calculated. Chi-square test was used to obtain p-value. The incidence of various conditions presenting acute abdomen was shown in the table below, where acute appendicitis was 53.8%, haloviscous perforation was 28.7%, acute intestinal obstruction was 12.5%, and blunt injury abdomen was 5%. Comparison of observed versus expected mortality rate. Predicted risk of mortality, the number of cases were 80, out of which expected number of patients was 7 and observed mortality was 5. In the group of 90 to 100%, the observed versus expected ratio is 1. On the whole, the observed versus expected ratio was 0.71 and the p-value was not significant. Comparison of observed versus expected morbidity rate. Out of 80 patients, expected morbidity was in 28 patients and observed morbidity was in 17 patients. And 90 to 100 group, the observed to expected ratio was 1 and the whole observed to expected ratio was 0.60 and p-value was not significant. The incidence of post-operative complications, wound infection was the highest in 14 with number of cases of 14, followed by wound dehiscence, and rest are chest infection, impaired renal function, hypotension, and respiratory failure. The basic tenet in healthcare is to provide quality care with reduction in adverse outcome. In the study, mortality was noted in 6.25% cases, which is close resemblance to the average mortality in other studies done by Vishwani and Associates and Afridi and Associates. The observed versus expected ratio for mortality was 0.71%. Leading cause of mortality was sepsis, which is noted in 5%, followed by aspiration pneumonitis, which was seen in 1.2%. P-Poisson score accurately predicts mortality in high-risk groups and over-predicts mortality in low-risk groups. This data was comparable with other studies done by Rod and Associates and Kitar and Associates. Validity of P-Poisson score in detecting mortality, the sensitivity of it was 100% and specificity was 97.3%. Positive predictive value is 71.43% and negative predictive value was 100%. Morbidity was noted in 21.25% cases and the combination cause of morbidity was found to be wound infection, which was 17.5%. Comparable to studies by Akbar and his associates, Vishwani and his associate, May and his associate. The observed versus expected ratio for morbidity was 0.6. P-Poisson score accurately predicts morbidity in both low and high risk groups. Validity of P-Poisson score is in detecting morbidity here. Sensitivity is 100%, but the specificity is 82.54%. Positive predictive value is 60.7% and negative predictive value is 100%. To conclude the study, P-Poisson score is a good tool for assessing surgical outcome and in turn the quality of surgical care provided in patients undergoing emergency gastrointestinal surgeries among Indian patients. Thank you.
Yeah, paper is open for discussion.
Doctor, actually, you said it is from the district level hospital. So obviously the basic common emergency surgeries are taken into account. Having variables and calculation through computerized calculator, do you think is it feasible in day-to-day practice or it only is useful for research purposes?
Sir, the main aim of the scoring system is to expect the mortality and morbidity of a patient. As the it is easy to calculate not on a day-to-day practice, but as you can do it on like a record, a medical section record, where we can see what is the morbidity and mortality rate in the patients by calculating on a web-based section.
Yeah. No other Indian studies are available?
Sir, which one is Indian studies available, sir?
Available. So you would have given a comparison from the Indian studies. Is it your study is anyway different from other studies? To get any, the conclusions about that study also you would have included, even though you have routinely mentioned those things, but real comparison you have not. Okay.
How will it affect your clinical practice, this scoring system?
Sir, when a patient comes to the emergency setting, we can actually, if a postgraduate doing a thesis or any paper presentation, we can actually see the patient in whether the negative predictive value is 100%, means the patient, it definitely says that the patient is not, mortality rate is 0%. And by this way, we can at least see the outcome of a patient in our emergency settings.
Important is how you counsel the patient attenders and see your own results. So,
yes.
Okay, whether the outcome is not as per expected, you should go back and see why it is not as per expected, and it will help you counsel the patients.
Yes.
So this is going to be the possible outcome, especially in patients who have the P-Poisson score and going to have negative outcomes. you can counsel them in a better way. Yeah.
One more thing which is seen here is specificity is very low, still your negative predictive value is high.
So the P% score size overprints the mortality, sir. That's why when the negative predictive value is 100%, it definitely says that the chances of patient of recovery is good.
Why specificity is low then?
87 point something. If it is 100%, why it is 87?
There is some
Okay.
miscalculation.
Yes. Specificity 87% and negative scoring is 100%. How it correlates? Okay. If it is done, we'll move on to next paper, Sangamitra. But after this paper, we're going to have a clinical discussions, case discussions. So all the students, I'm asking you to be ready. And Sangamitra, please come.
Just one more thing. After Sangamitra, we'll give 2 minutes time to the doctor, madam. Whose thing is interrupted? The Dr. Sushruta. Thank you, madam.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, everyone. Sir, am I audible?
Yeah, audible but not visible. Yeah.
I start now.
Yes.
My topic for paper presentation is clinical study to compare the efficacy of platelet-rich plasma versus conventional dressing in chronic non-healing leg ulcers. Chronic non-healing leg ulcers are a major health challenge, represent significant cost to healthcare system and reduce patient quality of life. The prevalence of leg ulcers is well documented to be vary between 0.18% and to 1%. And most common cause for amputations are diabetic ulcers. And apart from conventional methods to facilitate wound healing, various new methods are also emerging, such as cellular therapies, which include platelet-rich plasma. Platelets release certain growth factors like platelet-derived growth factor, epidermal growth factor, platelet factor 4, etc., which act locally and then enhance the wound healing process. And aim of this study is to compare the efficacy of autologous platelet-rich plasma in chronic non-healing leg ulcers with conventional dressing, and also to compare the rate of wound healing during the study in either group. And materials and methods, this is a prospective comparative study conducted on 46 patients, divided into two groups, 23 patients in study group, that is PRP dressing, and 23 patients in conventional dressing, and conducted for 1 year. The inclusion criteria are age group of 18 to 80 years with long-standing non-healing ulcers, all the type of ulcers, pressure sores, diabetic ulcers, traumatic ulcers, venous ulcers, all non-specific ulcers. Non-diabetic and diabetic both patients were included, and ulcer more than 4 weeks duration and less than 15 centimeter square size also included, and hemoglobin more than 10 gram percentage, and patients who were willing to participate in the study were included. Exclusion criteria were screening platelet count less than 1 per cubic mm, and patients with known or suspected osteomyelitis, severe infection, presence of cellulitis, ischemic changes, gangrenous, inadequate perfusion, and also with immunodeficiency, and patients with serum creatinine level above 1.5 and who are unwilling to participate in the study were excluded. Preparation of the material, the participant blood withdrawn from the antecubital vein, usually less than 20 ml, and it's based on the wound size, and it is added with 1 ml sodium citrate anticoagulant and gently shaken, then subjected to centrifugation. After first spin, based on the density of the blood cells, they were separated into 3 layers. Lowermost layer consists of RBCs, middle layer contains platelets and leukocytes, and the top layer is made up of platelet poor plasma. And after the second spin, platelet poor plasma is removed and platelet rich plasma was obtained. This is the figure A showing all the 3 layers after centrifugation, and figure B showing obtained platelet rich plasma. Dressing technique consists the ulcer first cleaned with normal saline, and platelet rich plasma was injected into surrounding wound area with a frequency of 2 times in a week. And then coming to results, the mean age in the study group was 51.7 years, and whereas in the control group 50.48 years. Out of 46 patients, 28 were male and 18 were female with a ratio of 1.5:1. This is a table showing comparison of various parameters of wound healing. 8-6 type of ulcer, fasting blood sugar, when we observe there is no significant difference. And when we observe percentage reduction in ulcer size, it is 43.40% with standard deviation of 3.74 in study group, and whereas only 14.03 plus with standard deviation of 3.45 in control group. And coming to duration of complete healing, it took 3.74 weeks with standard deviation of 0.45% in study group, and 6.26 weeks with standard deviation 0.54 in control group. And this is the table showing site of ulcer in this study. Most of the ulcers were found on dorsum of foot, and then followed by plantar aspect, then medial malleus and lateral malleus. This is the pie diagram showing etiology of chronic non-healing ulcers. Diabetic ulcers are the most common, and then coming to traumatic, venous, trophic and arterial ulcers. In the present study, it was observed that patients receiving platelet-rich plasma dressing had a better wound contraction of 43.40% as described earlier when compared to control group 14.03%. This is the diagram showing, this is the table showing the same with a p-value of less than 0.001, which is statistically significant. And this is the picture showing picture A before the application of platelet-rich plasma, and picture B showing after platelet-rich plasma application after 3 weeks. Usually the ulcer measurements were taken on day 1, day 7, day 15 and day 13. Coming to discussion, chronic non-healing leg ulcers management is still challenging even in the advanced medical era as it depends upon multiple factors. The main idea of wound dressing is to keep the wound moist and provide environment for healing so that to prevent the infection. And chronic wounds have been managed with different type of dressings. Platelet-rich plasma is also among them. Platelet-rich plasma is defined as plasma with a platelet level above peripheral blood concentration. Platelets are storage pools of growth factors, including platelet-derived growth factor, transforming growth factor, platelet-derived epidermal growth factor, vascular endothelial growth factor, insulin-like growth factor, etc. And when these platelets come in contact with the ulcer exposed endothelium within the wounds or damaged tissues, these factors are released and they work in a harmony with tissue repair mechanisms. Basically, these platelets act as a sealant over the tissue or the ulcer surface, and they act like a drug delivery system. They attract the undifferentiated cells, causing the cell proliferation and extracellular matrix deposition and remodeling to promote the wound healing. In a study by Knighton and his associates, they showed that the use of autologous platelet factors accelerated the wound healing with the formation of granulation tissue. This was the first clinical study that demonstrated the promising role of locally acting factors derived from autologous blood in promoting healing of chronic cutaneous ulcers. In a study by Driver and his associates in 40 patients suffering from ulcer more than 4 weeks duration, 68.4% of patients were cured with platelet-rich plasma and only 42.9% with conventional dressing. In this study, the wounds in subjects treated with platelet-rich plasma dressing contracted more than the wounds in control group. So I want to conclude that platelet-rich plasma dressing is an effective modality to facilitate wound contraction in patients suffering from lower limb ulcers and can also be used as an adjunct to conventional mode of treatment for non-healing lower limb ulcers. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
Sir, now the paper is open for discussion.
Have you compared the diabetes, the peripheral vascular disease, and both the groups are matched for all these other parameters?
No, sir. Each individual ulcers I didn't compare, sir. Overall, the
Group of patients.
yes, sir.
Group of patients where you used a platelet-rich plasma and those that had conventional dressing, is the demographics comparable
Yes, sir.
with respect to diabetes and peripheral vascular disease?
Yes, sir.
Oh, yes, as Prasad sir has pointed out, you would have done a subset analysis between the diabetes and non-diabetic ulcers because diabetes is one of the important pathological things as far as the foot ulcers are concerned. Okay, apart from that, with such a small size and in a non-RCT setting, okay, do you think the message followed by the others?
Sorry, sir, I didn't get
Sir, can you please repeat the question, sir? There is a problem in the audio.
Sir has pointed out, she would have done a subset analysis between the diabetes and non-diabetic patients separately, because diabetes is one of the important pathologies for these ulcers. Okay. And also such a small sample size, and it is not a randomized setting, even though it's a prospective. And want to ask her whether her study has really can give a message for others to follow.
Sir, sample size is very less, I agree, sir, but within the sample size, when compared between the both groups, it is adequate to conclude this thing, sir.
Thank you.
Well, one final question.
Sir.
Doctor, how frequently and how many times we have to do that platelet-rich plasma to the patient?
Sir, in this study, we did twice in a week, sir, but we can do thrice in a week for every 48 hours, sir.
Each time, how much blood is taken from the patient's cubital fossa?
Usually 20 ml, sir, less than 20 ml only.
So out of which, how much plasma we get?
Around 3 to 5 ml, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, if there are no questions, we will conclude this paper. And we will move on to the next one, sir, final one. Dr. Sushruta had a technical problem, so we are giving 2 minutes to conclude her presentation, followed by question and answers. Dr. Sushruta, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You please share your screen.
Sorry for the inconvenience caused, sir.
No problem. Technical problems are
And thank
common.
you for giving me a second opportunity, sir. Yes, sir. So I conclude my study by saying that microsurgery is can be successfully performed even with basic surgical equipment if a good technique and meticulous postoperative monitoring is done, and if the complications could be detected early and prophylactic antibiotic administration and by proper education of the patient. It is a feasible procedure with good outcome and can be made available to a larger group of people to meet the increasing demand. And these are my references.
Okay, you are done with your presentation? Now the paper is
Yes,
open
sir,
for
I'm done.
discussion.
Dr. Sushruta, for how many months was this study done?
14 months, sir.
You had 18 cases of fibular reconstructions.
19 cases of free fibulas. I'm sorry, sir. You're not audible.
That's a very good number. I'm audible now?
Sir, now you are audible, sir. Please, sir.
No, in these 14 cases of fibular
Not audible.
Sir, there is a voice problem.
how did you reconstruct the failures? Okay, I'll not
Yes.
talk then.
Yes, sir. For a few, we have used pectoralis major myocutaneous flap. For a few, we have used, for one case, we have used pectoralis myocutaneous flap. And for another case, we had to use deltopectoral flap, sir. And for another case, we have used pectoralis major myocutaneous flap, after which even that flap had a failure. And in order to, partial loss was there. In order to reconstruct, we had to use a forehead flap also later on. So we had to have alternative options in order to encounter with the flap losses and other complications.
Sir, are there any questions, sir? Further questions?
I think it is a very ambitious work, and just to show that we can do it when the expertise and will is available. So, well done for the surgeon.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So with this, we'll conclude this session. We thank all the chairpersons and judges waiting patiently since last 4.5 hours. Thank you for your time, sir. And
Name of the previous presenter, previous to her?
she Shushruta, sir. Previous is Sangamitra, Dr. Sangamitra.
Can I make one suggestion?
Sir, please, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Your voice is breaking, sir. But please.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Please suggest, sir.
Yeah. Now, in these PG paper presentations, we should not tell them the presentation was good. There are no comments on the presentation because the judges are marking them. So we have only ask a question and not give a clarification also. See, these are award papers. These are not regular paper presentations. So the chairperson need to control that.
Yes, sir.
Rejecting a question and the answer.
Yes, sir. Your voice is breaking, sir. Sir, your voice is breaking, but your point is well taken, sir. Definitely, we should not tell, but to encourage young surgeons, just because this is a primary platform, just we are telling that. But judges will not be biased by that, sir. But anyway,
No,
we'll take
These are paper presentations.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Otherwise, they are presenting regularly. That's no problem.
Yes, sir. Definitely, we'll take your
we
point,
should not
sir.
tell them a good presentation. You should not tell them that it's a very good presentation, good paper, and all that.
Yes, sir.
No, that is a wrong message we are sending to them.
Yes, sir. Your point is well taken, sir. We'll follow your suggestion, sir.
They should not even reveal their college name also, hospital name or college name.
Because it's the price paper, as Sir is pointing out, it should be like that.
Sir, thank you, sir. All young surgeons kindly note these points. Please follow from the next conference onwards. In spite of repeated suggestions, some of you have disclosed the identity. Kindly don't do that. And actually, before concluding the session, I would like to convey my gratitude to all the people who helped in this great academic feast. There are total 160 posters and 50 papers. Over a period of these were assessed over a period of 24 hours with the help of all senior surgeons and judges and coordinators. I thank TSASI and President and Secretary Jagdish Gaud sir for giving us the opportunity. And before concluding the session, I request the postgraduates, usually you should not present the paper which was presented in the previous conference. That is number one. But number two is, because our state conference, if you present, this can be presented in national conference because we are part of our organization. So I request all of you, 200 papers from our state should go to the virtual congress ASI 2020. So I request all of you, only time is short, only 9 days is there. So please send all abstract and wish you all the best. I request Jagdishwar Gaud sir to conclude. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll keep Dr. Sai Rajendra sir's suggestion in mind future, and thank Dr. Verma, who has worked hard for the last 1 week and interacted with all postgraduates. 3 cheers to him, and he did a great job. Thank you so much. We'll go on to the next session by Dr. Sridhar and Dr. Umakant. We apologize to Dr. Sai Babu for a little delay. It is there. We'll all stay till the end. After that, then we request them to take over.
Yeah, who are the presenters? Be ready. Dr. Sridhar sir and Umakant sir will take over now. After this session, quiz will be there. First presenter.